welcome, first and foremost. So I know that we've got people who are here for the first time and people who are here as regular and kind of long-standing members of the group. And we extend, of course, the warmest of welcomes to both. For those of you who've been coming for many years, you may well feel like you're coming to the group for the first time, because I appreciate for the last few times that we've met in different venues and different locations, and ever grander, it seems. So make the most of these opportunities that we have over the next 2 years here at the Welcome. Obviously, everybody comes with different expectations, and all of us recognise the challenges that lie either in coming to a group like this for the first time, or indeed different challenges that arise as you come periodically and at different stages in your journey with PCA. So whatever your hopes or expectations are from the meeting today, we sincerely hope that we will address and meet as many of those as we possibly can. By way of introduction, my name is Jill, and I help to coordinate the Rare Dementia Support Group Network, which provides obviously these groups and disease groups meetings for people affected by 4 other less common forms of dementia. The other introductions that I want to make are obviously to Seb, who is here and will speak to you in just a moment. Seb, as most of you know, is one of our kind of leading researchers in PCA and the director of the Created Out of Mind here at Welcome. Rachel and Jeanette are also with us today, and I wanted, if I could, to use the opportunity to thank Jeanette, who probably is still downstairs, welcoming and greeting. But for anybody who's organised any kind of meeting, we're all incredibly aware of the effort and the sort of last-minute stress that goes into organising an event like this. So I want to publicly thank Jeanette, and I have actually found that the way to her heart is these. So don't let her leave without the latest supply. We'll keep her sweet. And just to let you know, we are recording the session, as is now our norm, so that people who can't get to the meeting can access the information that we share here today. So assuming you are comfortable with that, it's an audio recording. If you ask a question, your question will be audio recorded, but for the greater good. I hope you agree. 1 or 2 other very quick notices to make before we start proper, and that is to introduce you, if I may, to some of the researchers who will have their material and their information present on those tables just outside this main area. So we have 3 tables set up for you with 3 different research interests represented on them. So I can see Nick walking into the room at the back here, so if you just kind of give us a wave. We have Nick, we have Zainab, and we have, thank you, Dilek and Ivana. Basically, what I would say is I would encourage you, if you wouldn't mind, to make your way to one of those tables and to speak to the researchers who will be delighted to explain a little bit about the research into PCA that they're currently involved with. So whether that's the project which is looking at the Amazon Echo and how voice control devices can help people with PCA around the home, whether it's the Read Clear tablet, which is an app which is looking at helping people with PCA to read more effectively, or indeed Zainab with her sort of more science-based sort of approach. She's very keen to speak to people who would consider reviewing some paperwork that she has and wants feedback on. So please, please, please use the opportunity to enrich yourselves of the research that's happening in this area at the moment. The other notice that I want to make is just to let you know that we are selling little handmade glass purple stars at this meeting as a fundraising effort. As you know, there is no core funding for any of the support group activities, so we are entirely dependent on our fundraised efforts. And this is the latest in a series of many that we've inflicted upon you over the years. So feel free to buy a star, or feel free to make a contribution, if you would like, towards the cost of lunch, if that feels appropriate. But know essentially that this meeting is not a charged-for event. It's an event to which we are just delighted you've been able to get to. So thank you for being with us. I had 1 or 2 other quick notices that I wanted to hand over to Seb to share with you before we move on to introduce Joshua, our first speaker.
Thank you, Jill. And just to echo Jill's very warm welcome, my name's Seb Crutch, and I'm one of the psychologists, and it's lovely to see such a well-attended meeting. I think this is the largest meeting of the PCA support group we've had, and that seems really befitting the fact that this is our 10th anniversary year. All this started with a group of about a dozen of us in a fairly grotty room in the National Hospital 10 years ago this year. And it's grown to the size it has, and into all these regional support group meetings that many of you I know attend and have great value from, and all the rich relationships that have developed from that. And no one's more responsible for that than Jill, and of more of that later. So my three quick reminders. One was to say the next meeting of this support group will actually have an international flavour because it's on Friday the 14th of July. And that coincides with the beginning of the Alzheimer's Association International Conference, which is the biggest meeting anywhere in the world of Alzheimer researchers and practitioners, and relating to all of the dementias, but certainly Alzheimer's disease and PCA included. The Alzheimer's Association, the American equivalent of the Alzheimer's Society, have kindly given us a small amount of money to try and encourage couples and family members and people, most importantly, living with dementia from other countries to come along and try and join us. So you will receive in due course an official invite, but it would be great if those of you who I know are in touch with people also walking the PCA journey in other countries, if you'd like to encourage them to perhaps come and join us on that occasion. And there'll be a special drinks reception that Jill and Jeanette and Rachel and others are organising in a beautiful space here in the Welcome Collection afterwards. The second announcement was to say that over the next few months, Rachel and I will be working to try and refine the 7 stages of PCA document, which I know a number of people have made use of. I know there have been some comments and sort of constructive criticism that it's time to give that a second pass and develop it a little bit more. So working with members of the support group, we'll be approaching you in due course for feedback on how we can make that the most useful document that it can be. And finally was just to say, in regard to ophthalmology input, we know that one of the repeating stories through many of our support group meetings has been the length of time it's taken for people to find out about what PCA is and the nature of the challenges that they're facing. So it's really gratifying to say that Moorfields Eye Hospital, one of the leading eye hospitals in the country, and all of their affiliated hospitals are trying to improve the clinical pathway for people who have sight problems that turned out to be problems of brain sight, not eyesight, like PCA. And so I'll be also approaching a few of you to ask whether you might come and campaign and stake our case to the hospital directors to say that there should be better links between eye health specialists and brain health specialists. But without further ado, I'll let Jill introduce our first speaker.
And in so doing, I just take no apology by sharing our sort of support group mantra, really, ahead of introducing Joshua, which is the same slide that we show at every meeting, because I think it's important to make the point that our meeting venues change and indeed get more and more impressive, and the research interest in PCA develops and grows, which is fantastic. But the primary and core reason that these meetings exist at all is to provide an opportunity for the people in this room, you, the people who live with PCA, to have access to this disease-specific information and to have access to opportunities to meet with each other and share what are often the most valuable and priceless contributions, which are ones that you, the experts in the room, share with each other. So by all means, we're thankful and we're grateful, but our core remit remains the same, and that is, as far as we ever can, to meet the needs of the people in this room. And so without further ado, if I can introduce Dr. Joshua Stott, who has joined us today. He is not only a member of staff over at UCL, but an Alzheimer's Society Research Fellow. I know he'll introduce himself in more detail, and we're all looking forward to hearing what he's got to tell us about cognitive behaviour therapy in dementia. So thank you.
Thanks, Jill. Can people hear me? Am I sufficiently loud? Good. Right. So yeah, I will just sort of expand on the introduction, just so that people have a flavour of where I'm coming from, really. So I'm a member of staff here in the clinical psychology department at UCL. So I'm involved in training clinical psychologists to work with people with dementia, among other things. And I'm also a sort of researcher in that area too. So working sort of what we call psychosocial interventions, which is a slightly jargony term, but meaning interventions that are about helping people to manage the psychological or social consequences of having a diagnosis of dementia or being affected by dementia. So that's my kind of interest in this. I also wanted to echo Jill's point about using your expertise, actually, because what I'm going to talk about today is cognitive behavioural therapy for people with dementia. But actually, and that's the level we're at. We're not at the level of looking at cognitive behavioural therapy at the moment for people with specific forms of dementia. So the evidence and the things I'm going to talk about are for people with dementia more generally. And I'd be really grateful, and it'd be really helpful to kind of share views at some point about how this applies to people living with or affected by PCA, because I realise that obviously it differs, the experience. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there at the moment, just so that people are aware of that. I'm first going to talk a bit about what cognitive behavioural therapy is, and then I'm going to talk a bit about how it's been adapted for people with dementia, why we need to bother with it, adapting it, and what the evidence for those adaptations is. I then want to talk briefly about mindfulness for people with dementia. I don't know whether you've had any talks or conversations on that, so I'm only going to briefly talk about that because I think that's something you've talked about, just because I've been involved in some recent research in it, which might be useful for you to know. And I'm also going to then talk about future directions and think about where we go. I will say that as I talk, if you have questions, do just ask or put your hand up. I'm more than happy just to try and incorporate that into the talk, particularly as I know that sometimes as psychologists we can slip into jargon and that's very unhelpful. So if there's any jargon that I use that doesn't make any sense, then please do let me know and avoid me waffling on with meaningless stuff. Hopefully I won't do that. Okay, so first I'm going to start with the idea of what is cognitive behavioural therapy. So cognitive behavioural therapy is a talking therapy. So it's a therapy that involves talking to help people manage their mood or anxiety that they might experience. And it's based on the premise that the way that we think about situations affects the way we act. And I guess the focus is on dealing with the here and now rather than focusing a lot on the past. And the therapist and client work together collaboratively to try and change the way in which someone might be thinking about a situation in order to help them feel better. And you'll see here this little diagram, and it may be hard for people, particularly if there's sort of visual kind of difficulties to understand this diagram. So I'll just kind of run it through verbally. Hopefully that will help. So there's an idea in cognitive behavioural therapy that the way we think about things creates the way we feel. And to give an example of that, if I'm going out to a dinner party, for example, and I'm really worried that I might forget what I'm going to say, and I think, oh, people are going to think I'm silly, I'm not very bright, I might be particularly anxious about that. Whereas if I think, actually, I'm going out to dinner party with lots of my friends here who've always supported me and always felt helpful towards me, I'm probably not going to feel anxious. So the way in which we think determines the way we feel is a central premise of CBT. The idea is then that the way in which we then behave reinforces that. And what I mean by that is that the way in which we then do things on the basis of our feelings or our thoughts makes our thoughts more likely. So, for example, in my dinner party example, if I then don't go to dinner parties, I never get to check out the view that people will think I'm boring or scary or that I'm silly, and therefore I never know the answer to that, and so I will continue avoiding it. So we have these kind of vicious cycles. Now that may sound worrying, a vicious cycle, but actually I think in some ways it's a good thing because it means we can do things at all of those levels. So we can help people to change the way they behave, we can help people to manage the way they feel, or we can help people to change the way they think in order to make themselves feel better. So there's a variety of different things we can do. I see it as an advantage. So this is just some examples of the sorts of things that we talk about in CBT. So we might try and change people's unhelpful thinking patterns. So people might have some ways of thinking about things that are unhelpful. So, for example, we might have people who are overgeneralising their sort of from one instance. And what I mean by that might be this dinner party example. So let's say you've been to a dinner party and forgotten what you're going to say, and then you think, oh, I always forget what I'm going to say, or potentially you've knocked something over because your visual means that you weren't able to completely sort of reach for that thing, and you think, oh, if I go to dinner parties, I'm just going to be a hazard, I'm going to be annoying to people, and therefore I don't want to go, and therefore I'm always going to be like that. That's a kind of overgeneralization from one instance. Does that make some kind of sense? People might also personalize things, so they might be walking along the street and potentially they're walking in a way that looks a little bit different to how other people walk. And so they think, why are these people looking at me? People are looking at me. They must be thinking I'm looking a bit strange, or I'm lost. And they've kind of personalised someone just happening to glance across the street and seeing them. That could just be the person was glancing across the street. But people personalise that, and it's quite a common thing. This is not unique to people with any form of dementia. It's a general thing. People might reason from their emotions. So people might think that because they feel ashamed, they therefore are shameful. So they kind of think because they feel they've done something bad, that represents a reality rather than it's just a feeling they're experiencing. So there are a number of different things that people might do in those settings. We might help people to try and change those. So that's what we might do in CBT. We might also help some sort of practical, helpful coping strategies. So, for example, many people that I've met are worried about going out, and they might just think this overarching thing of I can't go out ever on my own. And a goal-setting approach to that might be to try and break that down and think, okay, well, what specific things can you do? Could you go out once to this specific place at this specific time with these supports? So it's a kind of clearer kind of way of doing it that's much more manageable than setting the overarching goal. We might also do some sort of problem solving. So we might help people with a problem to manage that. For example, in the example I've sometimes used with people is using kind of GPS to help people manage where they're going. And sometimes we might use things called acceptance strategies, which you may have talked about in your mindfulness talk. I don't know. But this is the idea that there are some things that we can't problem solve. There are some things that just are. And I guess CBT is not about trying to just put a positive face on things. It's about acknowledging there are some things that just are. But the ways in which we manage that can vary. So, for example, in many people with many different health conditions, progressive or otherwise, people use mindfulness to do that. They try and help themselves think about this and not constantly ruminate upon the fact they have a condition, but just let the thought pass and think, well, what can I do otherwise? And I'm not saying that's an easy thing to do. I realise that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. But we might help people to try and work with that and manage that. We might also help people with communication skills. So frequently people are worried or ashamed or embarrassed about saying that they have a condition like PCA or any other form of dementia. And that can mean that people misinterpret what they do. And so we might help people think about how they would communicate their diagnosis if that was a helpful thing for them to do. So there are a number of different things we might do in CBT. So I guess just in terms of, I hope that gives a flavour. Does that sort of give a sense of what I mean by CBT? So it can be offered individually to couples, families or groups. And the sort of thing is kind of 5 to 20 weekly sessions that can vary in length. So it's quite kind of flexible. And specific difficulties are discussed and goals are set. I will say it's not a quick fix. It involves hard work on the part of both the therapist and also the clients working with them. So if people have a work in CBT, they will need to do things between seeing someone in order to help themselves manage any mood problems they may have. So why is CBT important for people with dementia? And as I say, this is a more general thing about dementia in general, although I think that anxiety and depression are issues that I'm sure are relevant for people with PCA as well. So in general, 850,000 people in the UK have dementia. And the anxiety prevalence, so the amount of people that have anxiety, is around between about 5 and 21% of those people with dementia. And the depression prevalence is 5 to 40%. That means, I think, and this is my mental arithmetic potentially going wrong, I think at the top end you have around 340,000 people with dementia who also have depression. So it's a big kind of group of people. And I guess the other thing to say, which I think is really important, is anxiety and depression are not inevitable. So some people, and I've heard this story from many people that I've seen in clinical work, that they go to the GP and they're sort of like, well, if I had this condition, I'd be depressed too. It may not be the kind of what they say, but it's the sort of attitude. And I think that's really important to say. Actually, this is not inevitable. This is not part of having a chronic illness of any sort, and it's something we can help people manage with. So I think it can be a real barrier if people think it's inevitable. So antidepressants in people with dementia in general, and I have to say, I don't think, Seb maybe correct me on this, but I don't think there's been specific work in PCA on this. But antidepressants, which are used for people to manage depression in who don't have a diagnosis of dementia, don't work in people with dementia. So they don't actually work. The biggest trial that we have to date of this found that side effects outweighed the benefits. They may work in PCA, and I don't know. I don't think we've got the evidence around that. But that kind of thing has led to the notion that we need to find other ways to help people with these things, particularly since in people with dementia more generally, depression is associated with earlier institutionalisation, associated with increased carer burden, and all sorts of problems that people may experience are associated with it. So we try and kind of think about other ways to help people. And that's where CBT comes in. Sorry about that slide. I don't know why it does that. This is my tech. I see all these high-tech kind of solutions going on, and my tech is obviously not quite as high-tech as that. Anyway, the aim of CBT, so what are we trying to do when we're trying to help people who have a diagnosis of dementia, be that PCA or any other form of dementia in CBT? Well, I'd say there's a kind of zone of therapy work, which is a bit of a jargony thing to say. But this is basically the idea that people who have a diagnosis of PCA or dementia of any sort have certain physical limits on what they can do, and we're not denying that. No one's denying that has that effect, and that that CBT is not a cure for that. That's not what we're talking about. However, there is in this sort of graph, and maybe easy just to explain it, on top of that, there are things that we may do or think or feel that make our situation worse, potentially, for us. And it's that we look at to try and help in CBT. So it's sometimes called excess disability. I don't know if you've heard that phrase. It's sometimes flung about in various different fora. But it's a phrase meaning that on top of the sort of disability that might be caused directly by a problem, by a condition, there is an excess disability that's caused by other factors. And that's the zone we're kind of operating in with CBT. We're trying to help people reduce their excess disability. And I'd actually say the same for any intervention that's focusing on psychological or social consequences. That's the fundamental aim that we're trying to do. So how do we adapt CBT for those people with dementia? So this is a kind of more general adaptations. I think many of them will be relevant to people with PCA, but they may not be. And I've got one slide here, which I don't know if it's the sort of the form really that one's supposed to do, but where I was kind of asking people to discuss whether they feel it's relevant, because I guess it's hard for me to know whether it's completely relevant. And as has been said a lot, you guys are the experts in the experience of having PCA. So one set of adaptations that we make to CBT for people with dementia is adaptations for ageing. So I realise with PCA this is slightly different actually. People may be younger, although many people may be older than average. But there are things that we know about adapting CBT in general in people without any form of dementia that we need to do when we're working with older people. Some of those are around things like simple things like services may not offer home visits, but actually how on earth do you get to this setting every week? And that can be a real challenge for people, and actually just by offering home visits you can make a massive difference. It may be that certainly in the past a number of people that I've met who were older had a view that therapy was for wimps, or that people were kind of weak if they sought out therapy. And I realise that's a common. I realise it's a view that people have, and I guess that view is one that I would wish not to challenge necessarily. I think everyone needs to think about what their take on these things are, but to discuss with someone. And I think we need to be aware that's associated with people who tend to be older. So we need to kind of help with that. Also, commonly, as people are older, they have a bigger involvement of carers or supportive others or family members or whatever the phrase that people like to use is. And we need to sort of involve those people in our sort of therapy work, because that's something we need to do. With the consent, I need to say this very clearly, with the consent of the person who is in the therapy, if you like. So being consensual about that and making sure that the person who is engaging in CBT wants that. So we need to do that. We also need to adapt for what I'm calling neurocognitive difficulties. Now, I should have said this earlier, actually. I meant to. It was on my slide and I neglected to. Cognitive behavioural therapy, the cognitive in cognitive behavioural therapy, I hope it's evident, refers to a thinking style. It doesn't refer to the way having memory problems or having visual problems or kind of brain vision problems. It doesn't refer to that. It refers to the way in which we think about a situation. Does that make sense? That's kind of important. And I should really say, when I'm talking about neurocognitive difficulties, those are the sort of difficulties that are to do with the brain in terms of brain visual problems or memory problems or language problems, those kind of things. Does that distinction make sense? So we need to adapt for people's neurocognitive difficulties. And this is, I think, particularly where it'd be very interesting to get people's views. And one thing we're thinking about doing some more research into is how this differs for different people with different types of dementia, because clearly the types of difficulties people have are very different. But some authors have argued that we need to remove or adapt these thinking style elements. So these elements about how we think about situations affecting the way we feel. In fact, one of the RCTs, the randomized controlled trials looking at this, just basically said, well, I don't think people with dementia are going to be able to manage that, so I'm just going to take it out. Which I'm not sure was the most helpful. And interesting, that was the least successful trial of the ones that has happened. So hopefully that I feel that's not the right approach. The other trial, though, did feel that it needs to be adapted and simplified so that people to account for people's difficulties. And I think that's probably the approach that I might take. We might structure and simplify the way in which CBT sessions are offered. So we might offer kind of frequent summaries of what's happened, offering information in ways that people can comprehend, whether that's visual or verbal is better, whatever's better for individuals. And we might use what's called cognitive rehabilitation, which is kind of, I guess, a bit of a flash term, I think, for really just setting a goal and finding ways around managing that. So, for example, it can be something as simple as, if you've got a way of thinking that you know is helpful, just sticking that on the fridge so you see it regularly so you can remember that's the way I want to think. So simple things like that. Generally, all of the CBT that we've done and all of the trials and research into cognitive behavioural therapy have involved a supportive other. So they've always involved the person living with dementia and someone else who's affected by that, who is a supportive other with them. I have a slight issue with that, in that I think that there are many people who are living with dementia who could probably engage in this and not have that. And I think we potentially ignore a whole group of people who could benefit by doing that, because there are many people who live alone with conditions. However, all the trials have done this to support memory and other neurocognitive functions. And as I said, it's flexible and consensual. And I will just say as well, for the purposes potentially of carers and people here, but caregiver support is not the stated aim in CBT for people with dementia. It's for the person who is living with dementia. There are trials, and you may have been talked to about these, I don't know, for carers of people with dementia using CBT to help them manage the way in which they're feeling directly, that have been very successful. And if you haven't had that or have information about that, if people need me to send information, I've got some various papers and interesting information about that too. So how has this been evaluated? What do we know? How effective is this approach is the next thing I just want to touch on. So after various small studies that have been done, there have been 2 randomised controlled trials, and both have had positive outcomes. There's only been 2, and they're quite small, and this is for people with any diagnosis of dementia, Stanley et al. Is the one that just took out the thinking style elements, so that's the one that was slightly less successful, and the Spector et al. Trial is the one that was done more recently and adapted the way in which we do CBT, but kept the core elements there. And the NICE guideline now recommends CBT for people with dementia, possibly involving carers. So I'm just going to kind of put up a little bit about the Spector et al. Trial, and the reason I do that is not because I realise kind of putting up loads of figures can be kind of not very helpful. The reason I do it is because I think it gives a sense of to whom the evidence applies, so to whom we know that this works for, so that we can think about who it might work for and where we need to go forward. So this was a trial that was of reasonable quality in terms of its research quality, but it was very small. Only had 25 people in each group. So it had a control group and an intervention group, and had 25 people in each group, which means that the evidence base for CBT for people with dementia is based on a small trial. And the people in the trial, people who went to have the CBT, the cognitive behavioural therapy, had a diagnosis of dementia, and they had significant anxiety. So it was CBT for anxiety, people with anxiety and dementia. And interestingly, or not, the trial did not distinguish between different types of dementia. So this was literally, you had to have a diagnosis of dementia. In fact, they didn't even record what diagnosis of dementia people had. So we don't know from that trial to what subtype or people's different diagnoses this might apply. And I don't know how people feel about that, but I think it's an interesting question going forward about how can we maybe adapt that, think about that. They had to have a family carer involved, and they had to be willing to discuss thoughts and feelings. Just a couple of things about the sorts of people that were in the trial that may not be apparent, and I hope they don't look too kind of techie. So the one thing was that the MMSE score, the median MMSE score was 23. What I mean by that is the amount of difficulties with neurocognition that people had in this trial was quite low. So people were very early in their dementia journey in this trial. But they did have very significant anxiety. So it says here there's a rating in anxiety and dementia scale, and they scored 19 on that. That's totally meaningless when I say it like that. What it means is that they had quite significant anxiety. That's actually so the people to whom this applies is people who feel very anxious and are very early in their dementia journey. Does that make sense? And what did they find? They found that it was feasible and effective. Interestingly, although the CBT was effective it was designed for anxiety, most of the people who came in, because they were so worried about stuff, also felt quite low in mood and were depressed too. And actually this trial had more effect on depression than it did on anxiety. So I think it probably means that if people are feeling low and are early in their journey, then this is a helpful intervention. In this case, they looked at memory being the barrier to participation. There may be other barriers in people who have other problems related to their dementia, but memory was not the main barrier to participation. So people could often still have benefits from this, even when they couldn't remember having ever been in therapy or who their therapist was or anything like that. There was no benefit to family carers. So this was, as I said, it wasn't aimed at that, and it didn't produce that benefit. I think the important thing, as I've said earlier, it's unknown whether some benefit more than others, or people with particular types of dementia benefit more than others. It's unknown what the active ingredients of therapy are. So it's unknown which bits of it helped. So which bits of this therapy actually produced a benefit for people. And these are some quotes. I'll read them out, although I always feel a bit dubious about reading out quotes, because it kind of, obviously you kind of cherry pick the good ones, and you don't necessarily put the sort of negative ones. I'm sure there were some negative ones. In general, though, it was a positively received intervention, so people really enjoyed coming along to the CBT and found it very helpful, I think, in terms of their lived experience. So they said it was therapeutic because you spoke about things that normally you would not speak about, and taboos, and that was a person with dementia. I was really happy to hear the person with dementia's points of view saying things that I'd never dreamt he would think, which was really nice. That was a carer. So I think it encourages open communication is one thing that we'd try and do. He sits back now more and thinks more rather than just panicking, and that was a carer who said that. I don't get so wound up. That's what a person with dementia said. And I do think it's a lot to do with what the therapist taught him, how to sort of relax a little bit more and to think things through. And that was what a carer said. So it was kind of a mixture of learning skills, learning about how to communicate together and feeling comfortable, I think, in the therapy environment. So that was what I wanted to talk about in terms of CBT. I was going to then touch on mindfulness. I don't know how I'm doing for time, actually. And then I was going to kind of open up the floor a bit, really, in relation to how this might relate to well, any questions or thoughts you had about what I've said, and also particularly if there are things about PCA that you feel this does or doesn't connect with. So mindfulness, I realise you've had a talk about this, so I'm going to be quite brief. I just thought it might be helpful just to touch on some of the sort of recent evidence for it. I guess I just wanted to, before I even do that, I just wanted to give a couple of caveats. So mindfulness now, I guess, I don't know, it seems to be one of these things that's become in vogue, and we have Ruby Wax kind of talking about mindfulness and saying it's the best thing since sliced bread and all of these kind of things. And I think therapies do that. They go in vogue and out of vogue. I think there are some issues with that. I think there are some issues with taking something that fundamentally comes from a particular standpoint, a Buddhist religious standpoint, and taking it into a secular environment, and sort of people have referred to it as Mac mindfulness at times. So I think I just want to recognise that debate's there, and then actually just say I'm going to recognise it's there, and then I'm going to kind of put it to one side because we don't have time to kind of talk in detail about that. But what I mean by mindfulness is it's used often to help people manage anxiety and to accept their feelings, as I said. And it's paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment and non-judgmentally. So there are various aspects. You need to pay attention, which can be quite hard if you're feeling really tired or in pain or have real cognitive difficulties. And you need to pay on purpose and to the present moment and non-judgmentally. And I guess the reason it's of interest for people who have dementia of any sort is that it may enhance, in people without dementia, there's some evidence that it may enhance neurocognition. So it might actually help people's attention and cognitive flexibility in people without dementia, and there's a review of that. It also reduces and prevents the recurrence of depression or anxiety. So it reduces if you feel depressed or anxious. It may reduce how bad you feel, and it may also prevent you getting depression or anxiety again. That's what the evidence suggests. So people have become very interested in it in terms of dementia for those two reasons. And consequently, it's been argued at 2 points it may be useful. So some people have argued it may serve a protective function against getting dementia because of this effect on neurocognition. And it may, some aspects or similar things to mindfulness may protect against future cognitive decline. There's some evidence coming now that meditation can, and there's a big trial going on here actually, I think, looking at whether mindfulness will reduce future cognitive decline. But it may also, I guess, and this is the area that I've been more sort of interested in or done more stuff in, is reduce anxiety and depression or enhance neurocognition in people who are living with dementia at the moment. So that's the other side of it. Does that make some kind of sense? So we did a small paper suggest, because some people have said, well, actually people with dementia can't do this, it's too hard. That's something that people may say. It's too difficult for people who have this diagnosis. And so we did a study to test that. We haven't actually published it yet, hopefully we will at some point, where we found that actually in a task that sort of replicated what people need to do in mindfulness, people with dementia actually could do just as well as people without. And people with early dementia, and not PCA specific. And we also have been involved in doing a small randomised control trial in care homes of people of a group mindfulness intervention. So where we did these kind of things where we helped people to pay attention to their breath non-judgmentally in the present moment. And we found that it increased people's quality of life in care homes, although it didn't reduce their anxiety and depression. So we found some evidence that actually it could be quite helpful for people actually in the later stages of dementia as a kind of structured intervention, and also that people with dementia may be able to engage in it, although people sort of have initially thought they couldn't. I think maybe they can. So we're doing some follow-up work on that and looking at that for people living in the community with diagnosis of dementia, and have actually been interested in doing something thinking about this approach for people with PCA, and I think Becky Gould, who maybe came to spoke to you, maybe mentioned that or thought about that, and we're thinking about that, although it's not quite clear whether that project will get off the ground at this stage for various reasons. Sure. It's measured. Oh, improved or measured, yeah. Yeah, measured again, improved, same thing really. So we use something called the QualAD, which is like a measure which splits up quality of life into various domains. So it says, you know, it's questions that people with dementia who have reasonably advanced dementia can answer. So it's things about kind of how do you feel about your memory? I can't think of examples of questions. And it's also split up into your activities that you're doing in your life. What are the other domains? There was one on, I think, on whether you're able to get enjoyment from activity. So it's a kind of variety of different domains, and it improved overall when you added all of those domains together. It improved relative to people before they started doing the intervention. They got better over the course of time, and in the control group, so a group of people who didn't have the intervention, it didn't get better. Now, what we don't know, for people interested in the sort of technical aspects of this, is why that was. Again, like with the CBT, we don't know why that got better. So all we know is that it gets better relative to a group of people who don't have it. What we don't know is, would any structured group do exactly the same thing? And I think that's a really important question. And we actually tried to measure people's ability to engage with the core aspects of mindfulness, and that didn't change over the course. So it may just be that it's a structured group that's helpful. And we don't know that. As I say, this was a group of people who had quite advanced problems. And we're interested now in sort of working with people who have less significant impairment to sort of try and think about that. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Sure, yeah. 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 Yes, of course. Yeah. They will. And I did try and make them as kind of friendly as possible, but I realise that may not be always possible. I hope that I did mean to say I hope the white and blue is helpful, but I can certainly, what I'll do is I'll send them round via Jill. Is that, I don't know the best way of doing it. Anyway, I'm sure we can work out a way, but I'm definitely happy to circulate. Absolutely. Okay. So as I say, I don't know what we're doing for time, so.
I'd say we're good for 5 or 10.
Right. Okay.
Can we please use the microphones for questions, because I think that's getting a bit lost.
Sure. Yes, of course. Yeah, I just forgot to report your question. Repeat your questions. My bad.
Hello.
Hello.
Had CBT
Sure.
before he was diagnosed with dementia, so he got a diagnosis of depression.
Right.
The therapist had obviously got no idea what was wrong with him,
Mm.
and gave him a form every week to fill in, saying on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel?
Yeah.
And some of it was 1 to 10, some of it was 1 to 5. Couldn't make any sense at all
No.
of the form. And the therapist ended up thinking he was putting it on and pretending. And it just got so difficult. We just stopped mutually. It was just getting worse and worse.
That's really, really interesting you should say that. And it actually relates to my current sort of, one of my interests actually. Because two things to say about that. One is that people who offer CBT don't really have very little in training or knowledge about dementia. So that's really important to say.
Yeah.
The second thing is that I want to think about how we can start rolling this out, because the only way that we're going to get access for people with dementia is by trying to roll out these adapted forms, which obviously would think about that.
Yeah.
And one of the big issues with that is the way services are structured. So there's something called improving access for psychological therapies, which is where most people get CBT. And in that service, you basically have to fill in about 1 billion measures, and you have to turn up there and you have to do it in like about half an hour, really quickly. It's just not set up for people with dementia at all. And one of the things I'm really keen on is we're going to do some research interviewing people in IAP services, doing exactly that, thinking about how it can be set up, and then trying to think, well, how can we use that to roll this out a bit better? Because that experience totally resonates with exactly what I think, and I'm sorry that you had it. And I hope that if you ever had it in the context of having dementia, it'd be a very different experience.
Yes, I think it might be.
Yeah. Sorry about
Thank
that. Thanks.
There's a lot of questions over what you're saying. What you're saying sounds good, but the reality doesn't seem to be possible.
Well, I think you're entirely right, actually, and I think one of the things that happens in research generally, I think, and this is me pontificating, is the idea, and I think it's a real interest at the moment, is this idea of implementation and thinking whole systems, because, as you say, it's a sort of knock-on effect. If you don't get diagnosed early enough, you can't take advantage of things that you would otherwise be able to take advantage of. So there's that whole stream of research now looking at early diagnosis, but then how do you then make sure that a GP in Cumbria who hasn't seen that research gets hold of it? And I think those kind of implementation questions are really, really important. I'm not saying I've got an answer to it,
I don't expect
but I do think that it's really important to do. Yeah.
Everything that what you're saying is very, very interesting.
Good.
But I cannot take that information at that rate. I can't do it. Now, I understand why you've done it, because you've got a lot of stuff to get through in a short time. Is there, are you going to recommend some books we can read or something like that?
Yeah,
Please.
that's a very good question, and two or three things to say about it. And I will try not to.
I just can't absorb the data. I know it's terrific, but I
Yeah.
can't absorb it.
No, that's totally fair enough, and it's yeah. So very helpful, and I think what I'm hoping is going to happen is I can forward the slides. Also, it'll be recorded, I believe, so that people can listen to it again, which I think was part of the sort of rationale for that. I hope, which is why I wanted to kind of cover a lot of information so people could have it at their fingertips should they need it. Also, there are some. The problem with books is they tend to be aimed at professionals or researchers, and they're not that helpful. I actually think it'd be very interesting to do a workbook for people that's aimed at clients. We don't have that at the moment. But I can definitely forward any books and things that are aimed at professionals, and also the slides and recordings, if that's helpful for you. Don't know if that answers your question at all.
Well, it's something that's slower and I can think about it.
Mm.
And that's the point. I was in the high-tech business, and when you're into that, it goes very fast because you're used to it.
Yeah.
I'm not used to it.
No, I appreciate that
What
it's
you're saying is great.
yeah.
But also, I would just like to ask that you're saying this, does it help with anxiety? Because he does have certain
It
issues
does.
with anxiety.
It does help with anxiety, yes. It helps more with depression, but it does help with anxiety too, and I think it can be very useful. And I think a therapist who was giving it would do it at a much more, one of the things we might do is adapt it to take a much slower, structured approach. So it wouldn't be like me firing information at you. It would be a much more collaborative kind of engaged process. So I would highly recommend it if people are feeling anxious, provided you can get access situations. Yeah, and I think that's what this is very helpful for. It kind of analyses the situation very specifically, particularly if you've been in a high-tech kind of world. It can quite fit with analysing a situation to try and make it feel better. So I think it can be very helpful.
Joshua, can you take one more question?
Sure, yeah.
Hi, Joshua.
Hi.
In attempting to follow through on what you're suggesting, which is to find a CBT consultant, I went onto the internet in order to do a search for a CBT professional, although I didn't necessarily use that word,
Sure.
and went through a sort of generic website that would promise to find you somebody who was competent. And out of 357 that it said that it had found, and with further information given as to the precise nature of the patient's illness, not one came back. So it supports two things. First of all, that there's a wide misunderstanding amongst those who are CBT practitioners of PCA and Alzheimer's and dementia in general. And secondly, that the website was crap.
Yes. Well,
but which leads me to my real question, which is, will you be developing? Are you able through the society or any source at all, a list of people who are both trained in CBT and in dementia?
it's a very good point. It's a very good question. What we've been more focusing on, and the answer is at the moment we're not, but I'll definitely take the suggestion on board, because what we've got at the moment, we've been focusing on trying to develop more manuals to distribute it so that people can learn and understand things, and we're trying to do that at the moment. But I think it's a very good point, and I think it's one that I'll take forward and think about, because I think it's very useful.
So I think we'd like to thank Joshua. It's always really helpful to have our minds open to new and other approaches. And